a flooring contractor. And he said, I've got about 5 or 6 debts that have been sitting around for the last 3 or 4 years. And I said, look, just go and reissue your invoices as payment claims. Wait and see what reaction you get. So he got no reaction. They just assumed it was a statement. And so then I issued a letter of demand to them. 2 of them paid straight away.
What is success to you?
I think it was a learn to love it experience.
And there's always pitfalls that you can fall in, but then you've got no one else to blame but yourself.
Number one thing if you're struggling is to catch up with people about it.
Hey guys, before we kick off this episode, I just want to thank our content partners. You guys know it, Abodo, for supporting the Better Builder podcast. Now, I've actually firsthand heard from a lot of builders who love working with Lambton Timbers. Over the last 20 years, they've perfected the art of thermally modifying New Zealand radiata. Now, that just means there's no chemicals on there. They pretty much just use steam and heat to modify the timber. So what does that mean? It's great on the tools, it's super light, it's durable and stable, which we know helps deliver a great end result for your clients. Good job, Abodo. Now, let's get this episode rolling. Finn Collins, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is a great bonus episode. We're going to be talking a bunch of legal matters, and that's why you're here.
Well, hopefully it will make it a bit more interesting than just the law, but yep.
Yeah, so you're a barrister from Lambton Chambers. You're the one that argues in court more so?
Sure.
Where the regular lawyer may not go argue in court. They'll just be working, with a client and negotiating behind the scenes. Is that right? Or do general lawyers also go to court?
Yeah, it's a bit mixed in New Zealand. So lawyers and law firms will do everything. But if you're looking for someone who's experienced, been around a while, and does a lot of court work, and you want to step away from a generalist, then you'd look to a barrister. Because certainly in my time as a lawyer in a law firm, I might do 1, maybe 2 trials a year. As a barrister, I might be doing 6 in 6 months. Yeah. So there's a huge change. There's a whole, and it's like the difference between a joiner and a carpenter. Who would you go to get your top end kitchen bench made from? Yeah,
for sure. So it's that specialist aspect, a lot of hours in court, and then there's a bit of a skill to it, a bit of a dance to it, a bit of theatre to it. Is that still
the
case?
it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
They call it a trial for a reason because it's tough. It's a very stressful process for anyone to go through. But, for me, I personally enjoy it. I like going through the process. And in particular, I act for a lot of subcontractors. So these are guys that, with the balance of power, they're typically at the lower end of the balance. So if you actually get into court and you have your day and you've got a good case, I know from having done this many times, how satisfying it is for them to sit there and go, hey, actually, you know what? This is actually quite cool. We're having our case heard. We're getting our side of the story across. The judge is understanding it. And actually, it'd be nice if we won, of course, but it's actually nice for people to understand where we're coming from. And I had one last year with an older builder who, when I say older, old school as well, in that he never did written contracts. He only did work by referral. He never set a price. He would do the job when he had the time. Work was always good. Clients loved him. And he'd sort of float below the radar. So he ended up doing some work for a couple that were both civil servants in Wellington. And they got him to do work. Started off fairly modest, as it often does, on effectively a charge-up basis. And 6 months later, he's suddenly taken on a huge scope of work. He's effectively renovating the whole house. And they claimed, because it grew into a payment dispute, they claimed that he'd agreed that he'd do all of this work for $50,000. And it was a magical round number. And I don't know anyone that agrees a magical round number of $50,000. It just, in my experience, that doesn't typically happen. But it didn't correlate as well with the amount of work that he was doing. So, of course, being a guy like that, nothing's in writing. So it's not until we get to court that he's actually able to explain what happened, what was said, and to say, hey, look, there was no discussion involving a whiteboard where we put up numbers. That never happened. There was no discussion on the porch where we talked about such and such. That didn't happen. And just for him to be able to get that off his chest and say it was gold. And he had such a good time that on the second day, I found that there was about 4 or 5 older looking builders down the end of the courtroom, and they'd come along to enjoy the show. And again, it's that power imbalance. They're suddenly enjoying seeing that, hey, actually we can even things up once we get to this stage.
Yeah.
Because often, a lot of disputes are about leverage and who's got the deepest pockets, and it can be hard work to get to a hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll talk a little bit about that today in terms of how to tip the scales of the power, and just by people understanding a bit more around the legislation and so forth. Before we get into that, so obviously times are getting a little bit leaner. Do you, especially in New Zealand, so do you see construction disputes increasing or decreasing at the moment? And sort of, what do you see out there? Because you're obviously front and centre.
Well, as the tide goes out, the number of disputes always increase, and I don't think this time around will be any different. I think there'll be a lot of professional negligence claims against consultants, and I do think that every dollar is going to be hard fought for. So yes, and I'm certainly seeing that. I'm seeing a lot more disputes coming up, because it was only a few years ago that money was cheap. It was easy to finance. It was easy to get finance. Times are very, very different now, and I'm seeing some really bad behaviour at the moment, and that's a reflection of people being desperate, that they see no option. They're probably in a bad mental place, and they're doing things that are just so objectionable that they're never going to win on that if it ever gets to see the day of a courtroom or an arbitration. But it is tough, but the lean times, in my view, are good for all of us to some extent, because as a tradie, this is the time to really hone your craft in terms of not just how you do your work, but how you manage your clients, getting your quotes right. To me, the quote proposal, whatever it might be, is the most critical document. It's a work of art. And as one builder once said to me, doing a quote, I've learned that the trick is it's not what you're quoting, it's what you're not quoting. And that's so true. It's making clear what you're actually not including in your price. That's where I see so many disputes, because owners or whoever they might be have an assumption that, or may make up an assumption at a later point, that no, your price included this and that, and et cetera, and so forth. And so getting the quote right is critical. And I think in these times, my first recommendation would be just go back and look at how you're quoting. Are your tags, exclusions fit for purpose? Are your terms and conditions fit for purpose? Do you even have terms and conditions? And I often say to tradies, look, you don't need to have 6 pages of small print. Usually, if it's a small value job and under $30,000, you don't need a written contract. So for a smaller job, you only really need 5 or 6 clauses. One is when the due date for payment is. This is often overlooked, but you need to have a date by when payment will be due. That they'll have to pay interest if they don't pay by that due date for payment. And it's got to be a hefty enough interest rate to make it actually, have a kick, because that's where you're trying to get that leverage again. No one wants to pay default interest. If they don't pay, they've got to pay your legal fees. Again, that's leverage, because everyone's going to panic and freak out at the idea of what a lawyer's going to charge and will not want to pay their opponent's legal bills. And also you want to have the ability to suspend work immediately without having to give notices or going through a process. You just want to stop work, and you want to stop giving work on credit as soon as they stop paying. Now, if you've got clauses to that effect, hey, you should be in pretty good shape. Everything else is a nice to have. You might limit your liability, or you might have a process for variations. A lot of those things, including variations, etc., you're going to have in the larger contracts, if you're signing up for jobs over 30,000, you're required to have them. Certified builders, master builders, both do really good forms of contracts, but your quote, your first very key contractual document is so critical. And that's where you should have your best person on the job. That's why builders, once they set up a business, often get off the tools because they need to manage that. Because that's where the money's going to come from. And that's the survival of their family, their staff, their business is based on how good they are at all the things they have to do, but in particular quoting. And then, of course, all the communication has got to be pretty spot on as you go through the project. And good communication is again, just so key as well. So, owning a building business is not for everybody because it does require some pretty good skill sets. And, you can be a brilliant carpenter, brilliant electrician. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be brilliant at running your own business. It's a whole nother game.
Yeah. So in terms of contract administration in the residential building sector out there, or even tipping into the sort of light commercial stuff, like how healthy is that out there at the moment from your point of view? Are people putting good contracts in place, or is it is there a lot of work still that needs to be done in terms of how safeguard?
Yeah. So I think we've unfortunately becoming a victim of of Australia and to some extent the UK, where contracts are heavily modified, and certainly in the commercial space, heavily modified to put all the risk, or as much of the risk as it can, on the contractor. And I'm still amazed at how many contractors will sign up to these contracts which have lots of what I call specials. So specials are all the amendments, often called special conditions. And they are getting tougher and tougher. So often I'm seeing, in particular at the moment, an increasing trend to have time bar clauses. And I call them the Queen of Hearts clause because they're so unreasonable that they're effectively like the Queen of Hearts in Alice in Wonderland saying, I'm going to chop off with your head. And that's what a time bar clause is. It is saying that if you don't notify a variation within a certain time frame, and it might often be 10 days, then you will not be entitled to be paid at all. Even if you do the work, you will not be entitled to be paid if the clause is set up that way. And so I'm seeing a lot of that sort of wording starting to come through. And so when I'm advising a contractor on how to review a contract, I always say, hunt for the money. The money is in your variations, extensions of time, provisional sums. All those things can change. Look at what they've done to amend the contract, because often they're using a standard form contract. Look at what they've done to amend those clauses, and that will give you a pretty good feel for how tough this contract is.
Yeah.
Because that's the first thing that they'll try and play around with. So once you've done that, then you can look at other things, but that's going to tell you how tough this particular client is going to be. I mean, I know certainly, the retirement village operators, they have some pretty large set of special conditions, and they often contract directly with the trade. So they'll go out and get their own electrician, get their own plumber, etc. And of course, it's a good relationship to have. But if things go wrong, you almost guarantee that the contract's not going to favour you. What I always say to subcontractors in particular is, look, I've reviewed, amended probably thousands of subcontracts. Well over 80% of all the subcontracts I've amended have not come back. So what I mean by that is that we go through, we cross out anything that looks, too vicious or mean or what have you. Cross it all out. Often we give reasons why we're doing it. It gets sent back to the quantity surveyor for the head contractor or contracts manager, whoever it might be. They're really busy. They're trying to organise a lot of sub-trades. They don't have time often to negotiate changes you've made to their subcontract. They just don't have time. And they'll just overlook it. So over 80%, I'd say, just they never come back. And it's the last shot wins. If you're the last person, you send a quote, they send you back a subcontract agreement, you go back on the subcontract agreement with some changes. If you're the last person to go back and make changes, then you win in terms of what's binding.
Yeah.
Last shot wins. The scariest thing I often see is subcontractors going, I received the subcontract, it looked pretty horrible, I decided I wouldn't sign it, and then I got on and started the job. But the reality is that their acceptance is by conduct. The fact is they haven't said anything to object to it, they've gone on and started the job, that's a deemed acceptance. And they kind of often intuitively know that when they come and see me, and they go, I probably should have gone back and quizzed, but I was kind of hopeful.
So this is, so if a builder, so say a builder's doing a $200,000 job, the contract gets signed by the client, gets sent to the builder doesn't sign it, but they start the work, that's deemed acceptance?
That's deemed acceptance. So probably more relevant if you're a builder doing architectural work where there's an architect, so the architect will produce the New Zealand Architects standard form of contract. Sometimes you will see some changes made to those. Most architects, in my experience, are pretty good. They know that it's not good for the project to have contracts that are over the top.
Yeah.
Well, that's certainly my experience. But occasionally the owner will get the lawyer involved, or they'll get a friend involved, and they'll play Mickey Mouse with the contract, and you'll end up with all sorts of weird things. And, a classic example might be liquidated damages for delay. And my experience, I always tell clients, if I'm acting for an owner, I say, don't have a liquidated damages provision. And the reason being is that no one is going to have the administrative resource to be able to manage that if they're going to be genuine about it, because it's not as simple as just saying, hey, you're late, I'm going to deduct delay damages from your final account. Because the builder might well be entitled to extensions of time due to any number of reasons, design changes, extra work that you've added, you might have got another deck, etc. They might have been delayed by factors outside their control. Now, if that's happened, they're entitled to extensions of time.
Yeah.
And that would, of course, push out the due date for completion, and that would, of course, affect the ability to claim liquidated damages. So unless somebody's going to be in there doing a detailed, comprehensive program and updating it every month, how on earth are you going to know whether your liquidated damages are actually genuinely a genuine deduction? And you'll end up with a challenge, and you will very likely lose because
so
you will not.
hard.
Yeah, it's too hard.
Yeah.
And what will happen? I said what will happen is you end up actually spending more cost on the process than you would want to. And I said what will also can happen is that the tougher you make a contract, if you've got a savvy builder, they'll go, okay, it's a tough contract, I can't change that, but what I can do is manage it. And then the builder becomes more claims focused. They're like, okay, so you're giving me 10 days to notify a variation. If I don't do it, I won't get paid. Okay, fine. I will notify every single possible variation, even if I think it's probably not, just to preserve my position. And I've seen that happen certainly in the commercial space.
So it becomes counterproductive almost.
Becomes counterproductive. It absolutely does. So I often, once I explain that to homeowners or homeowners' lawyers, look, I don't think this is a good idea, this is why, they'll be like, yeah. Because you can't have liquidated damages unless you give the builder the ability to claim extension of time. And if he's incurred more time on site, you'll end up with him claiming his P&G for extra days being on site.
So a contract being fair and reasonable is in everyone's best interest, really.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, I can understand certainly in the commercial space why some contracts have to be a bit tougher, and that's often due to the finance conditions, or it might be there's an underlying development agreement, or there's an underlying lease agreement that requires certain things. So I can certainly understand that, but in my experience, the tougher the contracts are, the more likely you're actually buying a fight.
Yeah, that makes sense. So from a builder's point of view, in terms of master builders, certified builders, both those contracts are pretty good in terms of a builder just looking to
Yeah.
do like a 500K renovation or something like that,
Yeah.
if they went any of those, that's fine.
Yeah. Look, I think they're actually both very good. And if I had my pick of the two, I'd be going with certified builders. I don't have any allegiance to either of those organisations, but for me, certified builders, I quite like the layout. I think it's very user friendly, and as a lawyer, I like some of the clauses, some of the things they've got in their contract, which I think are really, really good. But they're both very good contracts.
And if you compare them, say you compare any of those, or say the certified builder's contract with an architect's building contract.
Oh, chalk and cheese.
Chalk and cheese, right?
Chalk and cheese. I mean, both master builders and certified builders, they're builder industry created documents. They're created by builders for builders. They're very biased towards builders. I mean, actually, they're quite onerous towards the owner. But, it's a case of, well, who's carrying the risk here? The biggest problem we have in our industry is cash flow. And if you're not paid, it can have a huge, huge impact. So if you've got a whole lot of tough clauses about what happens if you're not paid, then so be it. If you've got the right to suspend, claim really high default interest, to have the ability to put a mortgage against the owner's home, etc., etc., and you have to step back and go, well, hold on, the builder is carrying the risk here, and the builder doesn't own the land. He's got no security. So they are absolutely chalk and cheese. The architect's contracts are very balanced. I quite like them too, but they are very, very balanced. But if you've got a high-end build, then ideally you've got an architect being in there doing an observation role and doing a contract administration role. And they're kind of a defence for the builder if they're doing a good job. And in my experience, a lot of them do a good job. And that they will tell the client, no, this is right, this is a genuine variation, or no, I don't think you're being fair to the builder. So you've got that, assuming you've got someone who's competent and independent, you've got that layer of defence in there with that type of contract. You don't have it on your standard build where you're acting for the client directly, and if the architect's not, they've possibly tried to save some money and not have the architect involved during the build.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so that's you got the main contractor or the builder. They have their contract with the client or the developer or whatever. That's fine. Let's talk about subcontractor agreements. We have a lot of, especially in the residential market, a lot of builders don't even have subcontractor agreements. Is that necessary? If so, why? And what's important to be in them?
Yeah, from a purist point of view, it's always good to have a contract because it helps regulate the position and especially if there's any issues. One thing I've always liked is that we have what we call a framework agreement with your subcontractor. And that's quite common, if you act for Stonewood Homes or GJ Gardeners, they often will have a framework agreement. They may not call it those particular words, they might call them a supply agreement. But basically it's an overarching agreement that sets out how you're going to work together, what your rates are going to be, how your rates are going to get adjusted on a per annum or every 6 months basis. And it's signed once, and it's going to apply to every single job you do in the future. So it could be that in 6 years' time there's an issue, you go back to the framework agreement to see how to resolve it. And so your sophisticated group builders, they'll have a framework agreement, they'll lock in your rates, and quite important document for both parties in terms of looking at them carefully. You lock in your rates, you lock in everything else, and away you go. And for every job thereafter, the admin person from the group builder, all they need to do is issue a purchase order, because everything's going to tie back to that original framework agreement. So I like those if you've got an ongoing relationship, which you typically do, with your subcontractors and they're doing work of a value that would justify it. But the reality is, I'm not going to be rushing out and saying you need to have subcontracts with all your trades. The law is going to imply anyway a whole lot of terms, and it's often just not practical or feasible. And most builders just don't have this level of resource so that they can get subcontracts signed up. I mean, that's quite a lot of work. So you could have a very simple framework agreement, but it's not necessary in it's only if you are really wanted to be absolutely purist and you really knew that you're going to have a continuing relationship.
Yeah, and I guess it would be relevant as well if something needs to get done, there's a time pressure and you need to kind of, make sure your subcontractor is getting the work done, you can then lean back on the contract in those instances.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, certainly ones I've been involved in drafting, we've said, well, if there's a failed council inspection, because there's a cost to that, of course, that subcontractor who called the inspection would be responsible for the fee. So things like that, because it's just about incentivising the right behaviour to go, just get the inspector in when you're genuinely ready, not because you're just rushing to try and get another milestone payment.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it, incentivising behaviour.
Yeah.
It's kind of like something to think about, when you're putting these additional clauses in or whatever.
Yeah, it is.
And the right behaviour.
That's right. I mean, a lot of good behaviour, especially in New Zealand, being a small market, is regulated by the fact that you're going, well, I might have to suck it up this time if I'm the subby, and put things right, because hell, I want to keep working for this guy for the next 20 years.
Yep.
And the amount of times I see quiet chats between a contractor and a plumber or a contractor and an electrician where they just quietly sort things out, that's how it should work.
Yeah. I was talking to Ed Kearney from Luxor Homes recently. We both know he's a client of yours and friend of yours. We just had a little conversation around different contracts, and he kind of mentioned one thing that I was going to ask you about, because some of the people used to have in their subcontractor agreement the if paid, when paid clause, right?
Yep.
Do you want to explain what that is and why it's no longer really legally binding?
Sure. So when I started out as a lawyer, 2002, I knew nothing at all about construction law. And I remember being in my office and my senior partner dropped a copy of the Construction Contracts Act on my desk, and he said, hey, I think you should read this. I think this is going to transform the industry. And I read it, and ever since then, I've been a huge fan, massive fan of the Construction Contracts Act. And that act, all it's about is really getting paid. It's just a way to get paid more quickly, because Parliament recognised that construction is so hard. It's so easy for disputes to arise. It's so easy for people to set off or make deductions, and ultimately it cripples the industry. And it had been, and it still is to some extent. So the key thing here is that it's a payment regime, and it involves a different way of doing your invoices, and I'm hopeful that many contractors listening to this are already doing this, and I'll come to that shortly. But it also outlawed pay when paid, and so that has been the case since the Act came into effect on the 1st of April 2003. So since the 1st of April 2003, it is illegal, it is prohibited to say to somebody, I haven't been paid by the client, so I can't pay you. You can't do that. Now, people do that. I still see in 2024 an email saying, I haven't been paid, so I can't pay you. I mean, I get it.
Yeah.
But it is illegal. You can't do it.
For the last 21 years, that's been illegal.
Yeah, and some people, when I say pay when paid's illegal, it's been illegal for the last over 20 years, they sort of look at me with surprise. Because they often think it's a genuine position to take. It's not. And sometimes having a firm email response just saying, hey, look, pay when paid is illegal. See Section 13 of the Construction Contracts Act. Couldn't be clearer. Then that actually helps often bring the discussion around to, well, what can you do?
Okay. Well, let's talk about the Construction Contracts Act a little bit and how that can help builders. And a lot of builders don't know about it, which is, even though it's been around for 21 years. We'll talk a little bit about how that can help builders make sure they get paid and make sure they sort of follow the right procedures. to ensure that they actually do get paid. And once you kind of understand it, because I've only been explained it to me like recently. Once you kind of start to get an understanding of it, it's quite beneficial if you do know your way around it, right? In terms of making sure that you can get paid quite easily compared to what people used to think, going to courts and all that sort of stuff, right? So as a lawyer, as a barrister, it's probably not in your favour to tell the whole world about it.
Oh no, it is. It's really cool. It's an amazing piece of law.
So do you want to explain the key aspects of it to us? What builders at least need to understand.
Okay, so it's a payment regime. So every invoice you send, irrespective of whether it's a residential job, commercial job, whether it's a floor sanding, putting on a roof, plumbing, electrical, anything that's effectively construction, you can issue or reissue your invoice as a payment claim. So you take your standard invoice and say you're using a Xero system. You go in, or you get your accountant to do it because they've got editing rights, and you make a few changes to your invoice. And by making these changes, you are making it an official payment claim. And the changes are that you've got to have a due date for payment, which if you're using Xero, you'll have that anyway. You've got to state the period during which the work for this claim, assuming it's a progress claim, you've got to state the period for which it's claims. You might say 1st of July to 31st of July. You don't have to get it exactly right. You just got to put a period. Then you've got to indicate how you calculated the amount. Now, if you've got a lump sum contract with milestone payments, real easy. You just put milestone, whatever number, etc. If you're doing a charge up, then you've got to show the rates for your staff. You've got to show how all the materials were calculated. And I always suggest, look, as good practice, you should really have a detailed, something like an Excel sheet or run sheet. You can even provide copies of your timesheets. My experience is the more transparent you are, the better.
Yeah.
Especially with cost plus on a residential job. I mean, it can work very well, but it does require a bit more work in terms of transparency. So that indicates how it's calculated. And you've got to state this is a payment claim under the Construction Contracts Act 2002. You've got to state that. So that's all
2003?
2002.
Oh, is it? 2002.
2002.
Okay.
So it came into effect in the 1st of April 2003. Right. So, yeah.
Okay.
But even if you got that year date wrong, it'd still be compliant. The courts won't get caught up in people making technical mistakes. They don't worry about that. Even if you got the due date for payment wrong, they'll go, yep, no, we'll still accept it's compliant. My experience of the judges, and I've done many, many, many claims for expired payment claims that haven't been paid, is that the judges are pretty receptive to the Construction Contracts Act. They like to see contractors getting paid. So that's certainly been my experience. And it's a very nice, simple law for them to enforce as well. So making those amendments to your invoice is pretty easy. And then once you've done it, your template's good to go. So every single invoice you've got is going to be a payment claim. But there's one further thing you've got to do. And it doesn't matter if it's residential or commercial, but you've got to add what's called a Form 1 information sheet. And you can, if you just Google it, Form 1 information sheet, Construction Contracts Act, you'll find it. But that has to be attached to every single invoice you send out. Every single one. That's actually the law. You're obliged to put that and attach it. So what's Form 1? Form 1 is a explanation of what happens if they don't pay your payment claim, or if they don't respond in time, in writing, to dispute it. And it tells them how they've got to dispute it. Because they can't just say, we dispute your invoice. They've got to do it. They've got to follow the process. So that's got to be attached. In my experience, no one ever reads it. And I've had so many builders and other tradies say to me, oh, look, I don't want to give the client impression that it's, sending them this invoice or this sheet of fine print, and they're going to go, what the hell's going on here? And I've said to them, well, you're obliged to because it's the law, but what's wrong with it? It makes you look professional. It's a good thing to have.
So that's very much like just a form, a templated form that you can attach.
pretty much a one-pager.
Yeah.
And it just explains in plain English what happens if they don't pay, etc.
Okay.
So, look, a lot of my clients who have used this for many years don't even think about it. They just go, yep, of course it's the right way to do it. This is the right way to do it. So what happens when you send that payment claim? So what you've effectively done is you've supercharged your invoice. You've turned it into something different. You've turned it into something that has legal power. And the legal power is this. If they do not respond to dispute your payment claim within the time frame set in your contract, which under certified builders, master builders is 5 working days, so it's pretty tight. If they don't respond within 5 working days, assuming you've got those contracts, disputing the invoice, payment claim, and setting out the reasons why they dispute it. That's critical. They've got to set out what the reasons why. They can't just hide behind a random comment like, the wife's upset because you put some muddy footprints on the carpet. That's
So it'd be almost like something that they'd say it almost in court, like some sort of like argument of why they're not going to, that's not reasonable for them to pay.
It's similar to what you'd expect to see from a quantity surveyor issuing a payment schedule, payment certificate, where you'd go, quantity surveyor would make it look really nice and pretty, but they'd have a short reason going, an example might be, you've claimed 95%, don't accept that it's at that percentage because you haven't finished off the insulation to this area. Full stop.
Specific.
It's got to be that. It's got to be crystal clear about what is going on. It doesn't have to go into chapter and verse, but it's got to indicate so you understand why they're not paying that part. And then they've got to state what amount they are going to pay. So it's forcing the person who receives your payment claim to actually properly engage.
Right. The onus is on them now
Yep. So they've got to engage. And they've got to say what they're going to pay. So, if they're really hostile, they'll put 0 or 0. But they've got to do that because that's part of the requirement. And we call that a payment schedule. So it's payment claim. They respond with a payment schedule. So what happens if they don't issue a payment schedule, but they don't pay? So what you can do then, and this is the magic of it, is that you can recover your debt and you're entitled to recover all your legal fees in doing so. And so a huge amount of work that I used to do was tradies would send me through an expired payment claim and say, hey Finn, these guys haven't paid, can you send a letter of demand? I'd send a letter of demand and I'd say, you need to pay this. This is the effect of the Construction Contracts Act. You're out of time to dispute it. You've got to pay now.
So just clarifying, if they don't reply within that period, it's done. No more argument.
Irrespective of any argument they've got to pay. They've got to pay. They can argue later through the normal process.
But they first have to pay.
They got to pay.
Right.
Yep. So that's why it's so powerful.
Sorry, I was interrupting you, and then you went back to your point, the further stage. So then you send it to them, and then they have to pay legal fees.
I would send a letter of demand to the person who hadn't paid. I'd explain to them, I'd have a standard letter, explain to them, hey, look, irrespective of any dispute you've got, consequences of the Construction Contracts Act, you didn't issue a payment schedule, you're obliged to pay in full. And if you do not pay within 5 working days, you've got to pay our legal fees. And by the way, you've got to pay our legal fees for issuing this letter. And you go, well, okay, what does it cost to issue a letter? Not that much, especially a standard template letter. If your debt is, say, $5,000, most people would not dream of going to a lawyer for $5,000. But if you've got an expired payment claim, you go, well, why wouldn't you? Because the lawyer might charge a few $100s for sending the letter. But if the people pay, well, actually, that's better than the debt recovery agencies, who take a percentage.
Yep.
That's not bad. And if it's a larger amount, this is the biggest problem we've got in the industry, I think, is that how do you recover a debt between $1,000 and $70,000? It's not economic to go through a traditional legal process. It's not economic at all. This way you can make it economic. So you can, if you've got your system set up right, it makes you look professional. It helps you and your family survive and your business thrive. And it doesn't take that much work. That's the beauty of it. So my experience is that if people have got a genuine issue with your work or something's gone on and they receive a payment claim, they'll tell you within 48 hours.
Yep.
And if they do have a genuine grievance, you might decide, look, I'm not going to go down that path. But where we'd get a lot of work is that there's a lot of rat bags out there, and they wouldn't pay until, or they wouldn't say that they were going to refuse to pay, and they wouldn't raise a dispute until you chased payment. So you might send your invoice, and then a month later be like, hey, you haven't paid, and they'll be like, oh yeah, I was a bit unhappy with, you locked the cat indoors or whatever they did, whatever you did. I'm not going to pay. So they're the rat bags. You know that they're taking the piss.
And even the people that aren't quote unquote rat bags, they're all very happy with the quote until they have to hand over the money. Then all of a sudden they start looking around and going, ooh, did they do everything right?
That's right, yeah.
And so, okay, so to clarify as well, just if someone writes a payment claim on the invoice, that doesn't mean it's a payment claim, right? Just if the invoice is how it normally is, but they just add payment claim, that's not enough. It has to follow all those steps.
It's got to follow all the criteria. Due date for payment, indicate how it's calculated. Because actually go to the name of the project as well, but a street address is normally fine. Got to have its payment claim. Got to have the period during which the work was carried out. Got to have that form and information sheet.
Yeah.
And it breaks my heart when I get a payment claim from a client, and they'll say, "Oh, look, here you go. We've done everything you followed." And then I'll go, "Did you attach the form and information sheet?" And they've, "Oh, I forgot about that. Sorry." Well, okay, well, you're gonna have to wait, and then at the right time reissue. It's a shame.
So people may then ask, okay, well, I already have sent an invoice. I didn't do a payment claim properly. I just did it through an invoice. Now there's a guy, he's a rat bag or non-rat bag that doesn't want to pay. I just can't get hold of him. He doesn't want to pay me. It's overdue by 6 months. Can they now do a payment claim, or how does that work?
I was asked exactly that same question by a flooring contractor who did work all around New Zealand. And he said, I've got about 5 or 6 debts that have been sitting around for the last 3 or 4 years that I haven't been paid, and it kind of really irritates me. And I said, well, as long as you're within 6 years of issuing that invoice, 6 years, it's after that it'll be time barred, then no problems, just reissue them as a payment claim. They'll probably think it's a statement that they're receiving. Fine, great. I've no concern at all about them thinking it's a statement, because, hey, they haven't paid you. Who's the bad guy here? So I said, look, just go and reissue your payment claims, your invoices as payment claims. Wait and see what reaction you get. So you got no reaction. They just assumed it was a statement. And so then I issued a letter of demand to them. 2 of them paid straight away. The others, I had to file an application for summary judgment. So summary judgment is basically saying to the court, there's no defence. This is a statutory right. We have to be paid. We're entitled to our legal costs. And then they paid after receiving the court proceedings, and they paid the legal fees as well.
So the beauty of these rat bags are that they eventually will get that. They'll go to their lawyers to try to fight it, and then their lawyers will go, sorry, we don't have a leg to stand on.
Yeah, that's right, because this has been around for quite a long time now. So, certainly I've had to give that advice that they've said, hey, look, this lawyer sent me this demand, and he says I've got to pay, but look, we don't want to pay these people. We've got a dispute. And I've had to say to them, you have to pay, and if you don't pay, you're going to end up with a much bigger debt, because you'll be paying his lawyer's fees. So quietly pay it and then bring your dispute. And what I've often found is that once a debt has been paid, the majority of cases, the owners who say they've got a dispute, it seems to magically melt away.
Yep.
It's sort of, they just can't be bothered going through the process, because it's that balance of power again. They've had to give the money up. To get that money back, they'd have to go and get lawyers involved and have to spend a whole lot of money, but the economics don't make sense, because you try and engage a lawyer to recover $50,000, you're going to run out of steam pretty quickly.
Yeah,
it's just not economic.
And I guess so if you flip it on the other side of the coin as well, for, you're looking at subcontractors, and some builders are subcontractors, right, to head contractors or even with developers or whatever, or head contract with a developer. It can be flipped, these things, right, because even as a head contractor or subcontractor, if you don't have knowledge of the CCA, but someone else do, they can very easily use that against you.
Yep.
So it's not enough to put your head in the sand and go, oh, okay, this is great, but most of my clients pay. I don't have to worry about this, because they can flip the script, right? Where if they know that you don't have knowledge of the CCA, and they will just they can always come back and renegotiate. I'm just kind of thinking, if, say for instance, you don't understand the CCA and you have an invoice for, let's call it a rat bag developer or someone, right? And the invoice is for like 70 grand. It's very easy for them to go, okay, if this guy takes me to court, it's going to cost him 50K of court fees or whatever. So what I'll do is I'll go back to him and go, hey, we know it's going to cost you, say, 30K in court fees. You owe me 70, or I owe you 70. Let's renegotiate. Let's call it an even 25 or 30 grand. You know, they can use that against you if you don't understand these things.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, first point I'd make is that I think as anyone owning a business in the construction industry, you've got to have some knowledge of law. It's unavoidable. I mean, you do that anyway through knowledge of the Building Act, Building Code. But as a matter of survival, I'd say you need to know your way around the Construction Contracts Act. And it's a no-brainer. It's a good investment of your time. But yeah, a developer can do that. They can come back and say, oh, look, it'll cost you money, legal fees to pursue this. Look, tell you what, I'll pay you this amount instead. And what I would say to the builder or the subcontractor is, you're entitled to all of your legal fees to be paid. You've got a statutory right to that. Do not give that up. Don't look at the wall. Just put your foot down on the throttle and just keep going. Don't stop. And at my old firm, and there's another firm that also does this, we would do this on the basis that we would not get paid unless we recovered the debt. So if there was a valid expired payment claim, we'd say, okay, look, if you pay the filing fees and the cost of the letter of demand, then we'll take the risk. Because we know if this person owns the property, we know that we'll get paid. And we're happy to do that. And if we were doing such a big number of these that it worked really, really well. Because, it was like throwing a rugby down the rugby field. You'd have to run for a while before you caught it, but you would catch it as long as they had property. If it was hopeless if it was against a company that was likely to be insolvent and was likely to be going into liquidation. And I think the message to some extent has been getting out there, because we've applied for summary judgment on so many of these debts, and we've got so many court decisions on it that we're saying, we can often say to a developer, yeah, we're not playing that game. Look, here's a recent decision where we went through the process. These are the legal costs that were awarded. This is what we do all the time. We enjoy doing it. We've got instructions to go. We're not going to it's not up for negotiation. If you've got a genuine dispute, then that's a different issue.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess the moral of the story, the takeaway is that if people have low value, meaning under, 70 grand or whatever, in terms of invoices that are outstanding, that they are almost ready to write off, because they can't afford to go to court with it. It's not worth it. They can, through the CCA, still go through payment claim process, get that.
And they should. I just am amazed at how much small debts are written off in the industry. And I think, the finishing trades are probably the most vulnerable, the painters, floor sanders, and other finishing trades. It just breaks your heart to see what these guys are losing. And everything you're doing as a trade is actually hard work, especially in those trades. There's a lot of labour and there's a real cost. There's not, the margin is there, but most of it is actual cost.
Yeah, cost of doing business, yeah.
So I'd be saying, yes, absolutely, go for it.
Yeah. Okay, that's very good. So in terms of difference in cost, and then we'll run through some questions that were answered from our Better Builder Club members and our Instagram as well. In terms of the difference in cost, then now, if you follow a payment claim through the CCA versus going through the court system, say you had a $100,000 invoice that was outstanding, what would be the difference? Just hypothetically, what would be the difference in cost of actually getting that 100K to be paid using the payment claim versus just the invoice and going through the district court and high court.
Okay. So there's a huge difference. One is cost neutral, because if you go through the payment claim process, you should win because your payment claim should be valid, and assuming there's no payment schedule or there's an invalid payment schedule. So you can recover all of your costs. So it's cost neutral. And as I said, there's at least 2 law firms that do this work on a conditional fee basis. They don't get paid unless they recover. And that's dealt with in summary judgments. That takes about between 3 to 6 months generally, depending on how busy the judge is and how strongly it's opposed. The other option is the traditional, which is you just go on, you argue the dispute, you argue it on its merits. We now, again under the Construction Contracts Act, have the ability to get a decision through what we call adjudication. And building construction law has always been a bit different as well, because most construction disputes are not resolved through the district court. And the reason being for that is that most building contracts will have an arbitration clause. So arbitration is exactly the same as the court process, or pretty much the same. It's just it's user pays as opposed to the public system. And you choose your arbitrator, you pay your arbitrator, you pay for the venue where you can have the hearing, and it's confidential. Public system court, you don't pay for the judge, but you do pay some filing fees. And that takes a lot longer. It's a bit like the public health system versus private insurance. So arbitration will get you a final result. But if you want a quick result, then you can go to what's called adjudication, and that was introduced in the Construction Contracts Act. So adjudication takes about 6 to 10 weeks. There's no hearing. It's all done on the papers, so it's all done by remote control. You effectively just submit your claim, which is effectively a submission, and you'll have a copy of all the relevant documents. You'll always have a copy of the contract, the relevant plan, specification, and you might have some witness statements. Pretty much always do have a witness statement. And sometimes you might even have a statement from a quantity surveyor or another expert. And your opponent has to go through and provide a response and provide similar documents. And look, I'm shortening up this process, but that takes about 6 to 10 weeks. It is meant to be cheaper than the court process, but it depends on how complex the dispute is. So for a $100,000 dispute, you have to always weigh up, well, what's this particular dispute going to cost, and is it worth it?
Yeah.
Because it might be a very simple dispute, and you go, okay, look, we can do this fairly economically. This is going to be the cost of the adjudicator. This is the person who will make the decision. Their costs will be shared equally. But I would say that even then, for $100,000, it can be quite challenging to make it economical.
Right, so it would start to chip into that pretty quickly.
And that's why you do need your quote or your contract has got to be good quality, because you want to have the leverage, not necessarily in the dispute, you want to have the leverage right from the start.
Yeah.
And you want to build up that leverage at all times during the project. So if there is a dispute, you're going to win at that point. You're not going to win in a hearing, you're going to win at that point, because you say, no, that's wrong. Here's my email that notified you of this variation. Here's a photograph that shows why it's a variation, or it might have been a rotten beer or whatever. And you win that way. That's the most cost-effective way to do it. And that way you never need to see a lawyer or see the inside of a courtroom or spend the cost on any process. So, my experience, the successful builders, tradies, are ones that actually just stop, and it does take more time, but get things in writing. And I think the particular risk as well is that the reality is that if an architect or an engineer or another consultant is perhaps at risk in some way or at fault in some way, and it's your word against theirs, my view is there's a bias against the builder in that respect.
Right.
That the professional will get a bit of a free ride to some extent. And so I say to builders, tradies, that means you've just got to be smarter. You've got to work harder. That means if you're, for example, you're doing your set out and you realise that, you might be doing renovation to an existing building. It's going to have a second floor added on. You're doing your set out and you realise that the loading for the steel beams that are going to go on is not quite right. And actually that's going to mean that the stair is going to not line up with the front door. And you know it's an architect's problem. You've got to stop. And you've got to write to the architect. It can be a short email. Say, this is wrong. Send me through a revised drawing. Sorry, I cannot continue until I've got that. Some builders, in my experience, are trying so hard to be helpful that they'll do a phone call to the architect. Architect might deny it or might say, oh, yeah, sorry about that. They'll try and work it out and they'll do something. But later on, when there's a bigger bill coming through, and the owner goes, what's going on here? And the architect, oh, no, he misread my plans. And if he says something to that effect, the architect is more likely to be believed if there's a formal dispute process. That's why you've got to be smart. As a builder, you have to recognise that bias and you've got to manage it. And some builders have learnt the hard way, they do that.
Yeah.
But I always say to builders, you've got to be the guy that actually has to work a little bit harder. Because if there's a dispute between you and a professional, it's highly likely that the professional will win.
Yeah. And you can sit around and say that's not fair, but that's the game. So play the game.
Yeah, understand the game, play it.
Yeah, very good. This is very helpful stuff. We're just running out of time here, and I've got to let you go, Finn. But a few questions here, just from our people from our club, as well as the Instagram. Can a subby send an invoice 18 months after they completed a job? Is there a time cap?
Yes, so they can, but there will be a question of prejudice. So I often talk about this in the sense of a variation. You might be in a job that's, say, 12 months, 18 months long, and you've got a great relationship with the head contractor or the owner or whoever. So there's a few variations, but you're kind of like, oh, look, I'm pretty busy. We'll pick that up in the final account. You then develop a relationship that's maybe not so good as you get closer to that final account. You then go, right, I'm actually losing money on this job. I better actually look really hard and find all variations, and I better put them in now. And the reaction you're going to get is probably not going to be great. But what they will look at if you get to an arbitration or go through an adjudication is, okay, so there's no time bar in the contract, in this particular contract, for you to notify this variation. You're late, but there's no time bar. So what's the consequence? So they look at the prejudice that's been potentially suffered. So they'll look at that variation and they'll say, could that cost have been avoided had we known about it at the time? For example, could we have done a little redesign to avoid that extra work having to be done? Or could we got a cheaper price from somewhere else? And if they can prove that, and to the extent they can show that that variation should be reduced, then they're going to have a pretty good argument. It's all factual. You have to kind of get into the granular detail of every variation, because sometimes there's going to be no prejudice. It was late, but hey, look, there's no prejudice. You've suffered no loss. But that's always going to be the argument. And that's, again, with a subcontractor issuing his invoice really late, might be saying, well, hold on, if I'd known about that, is that a claim that I could have been paid upstairs from by the client? Is this a head contract claim, or is it purely a domestic one that is just between you and me, and
right?
You know, the contract and the subby.
But if it's a bit more just clean cut, like they did some work, they forgot to invoice, and then they invoice 18 months later, that's...
Yeah, they're just, then they're entitled to do that.
Yeah, okay. Any sort of just quick basic advice for someone about to go out on their own as a builder, you know, from a qualified guy to starting their own business? Yeah,
look, I learnt a lot of my trade from older builders, talking me through experiences. They talked me through their tags, their exclusions, and that might be surprising to hear from a lawyer, but actually I did learn my trade a lot that way. In particular from some of the specialist subcontractors, steel fabricators, mechanical ventilation, because those guys are often in disputes. It's just the nature of what their trade is. So I would suggest it's worthwhile getting a mentor. Every bad experience should ultimately be a good experience in the sense that it should be passed on and explain what went wrong, why, so it doesn't happen again, or you save somebody else from that experience.
I think that's really good advice. Just tapping someone on the shoulder.
Yeah.
That's a bit more experienced.
Yeah, I mean, a good mentor is such a valuable thing to have. But think about your contracting, how you're going to do your contracting, and go and talk to a specialist lawyer who specialises in construction law, because a generalist might actually put you wrong, not because they're incompetent, but just they don't know what they don't know.
Yeah.
And use the resources like certified builders, master builders, use their contracts. They are good. Don't go and print some random contract off the internet or get someone from a mate for free. Spend a bit of money, get a good contract, get a good quote template. I mean, this is my view, but don't go off and talk to the debt collection agencies about their contract documents. They're generic.
Yeah,
they're not.
Construction has its own law.
Yeah, construction is too unique. It is too, in my experience, too complicated. It's got to have its own special contracts, and that's why we have standard forms that are available. And there's various types out there, but all of those contracts have been developed over decades, possibly even longer, through hard-earned experience. It's a good investment to use a contract that's been around and that's industry focused.
Yeah, no, that's very good advice. Interest. Some of these questions have already been answered. Interest on outstanding accounts, do's and don'ts. I guess they're pretty much asking, should you put interest on outstanding in your contract, I guess, if it's outstanding?
Yep, absolutely. And don't put it on your... And sometimes you see some tradies putting terms and conditions on their invoices, but that's no help really, because an invoice is not a contractual document. It's just a note to pay. You've got to have your terms and conditions in your quote or your contract. That's when they're binding. That's when they'll bite.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I always say you've got to have interest is that it's something that can be a giveaway. If you've got a bad debt, you can say, hey, look, I'm adding interest. Okay, that's a good incentive for them to pay. You can also say to them, hey, look, if you pay by this Friday, I won't charge you interest. Then you're not giving away your profit, because often you hear, oh, look, I'll drop 10% if you pay this week. Okay, well, that's a good part of your profit margin gone.
Yeah.
Interest is almost like, it's not a free giveaway because there's a financing cost to a debt being paid late, but it doesn't hurt as much to say, look, I'll wipe the interest. And then you keep your relationship. They think, geez, he's a good guy. But you're not being bitten too hard in doing that for them.
Yeah.
So I say it's something that you have, but it's something you can at your discretion decide whether or not you charge it.
Yeah. There's one person asking here the correct way to deal with drug and alcohol abuse in the workplace, but that's probably more like employment law.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't have a clue.
Yeah, so that's probably specific to just...
Yeah, I'd run a mile from giving advice on that. I'd leave that to an employment lawyer.
Yeah, and then there's just talking about T's and C's, which we kind of talked about. Are the actual prerequisites for a builder's license? Hard to find an answer. Do you know anything about that? It's probably not.
I presume that must be the LPB scheme.
Yeah,
But again, that's an industry-specific issue. That's.
And then the last one here: what are issues that be easily prevented? Better contract wording, etc. I mean, we did cover it, but is there anything else you want to add to that? And we'll probably finish up on that if there's anything else you can add. So, anything that could easily be prevented in terms of contracts or contract wording or anything like that?
Probably the thing I haven't talked about is that you'll know if you meet a potential client for the first time, you're going to know within 10 minutes whether they're going to be trouble. And it's knowing when to walk away, when to be the Kenny Rogers. And I know that every builder that's got into a really horrific dispute, all of them have said to me, I actually thought this person could be trouble when I first met them.
Yeah.
And you've got to rely on that intuition. Your gut instincts are probably the most valuable tool you've got. Most of us who've been around a while, you can always smell trouble before it happens. So you want to constantly build on your intuition, your gut instinct, and go, okay, how do I manage this? And sometimes managing it is to walk away if you're at a point where you haven't, agreed anything.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to finish it off. Follow your gut. Look for that alignment. You know, if you sort of misaligned, then maybe walk away. If you smell something fishy, walk away.
Yep.
But yeah, thank you so much, Finn, for coming on. You know, you came all the way from Wellington to come talk to us. I know you had some other meetings, but, you know, we'll say you came here for us. And I think that would have been very valuable in terms of people looking to get paid and increasing the chances of them getting paid. And I think that's super important, especially as things get a bit more lean.
No, look, I've enjoyed it, and good luck to everyone who's listening and getting through the next, what might be a couple of rocky years.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Finn.
I was asked exactly that same question by a flooring contractor. And he said, you know, I've got about 5 or 6 debts that have been sitting around for the last 3 or 4 years. And I said, look, just go and reissue your payment claims, your invoices as payment claims. Wait and see what reaction you get. So he got no reaction. They just assumed it was a statement. And so then I issued a letter of demand to them. 2 of them paid straight away.